All right. Do you want to kick off your presentation?
I don't think anything would give me greater pleasure.
Go for it.
Okay, I will gratify myself in that case. So, how's that looking? You see it?
We can see it. We can hear you. Go for it.
Fantastic. Okay, I don't suppose you would like me to trespass any further on your good natures by introducing myself, but what I will do is I will allow my compadre, Rob Reeve, to introduce himself, because I don't think you've heard from him yet, but I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot more from him in the future.
I was going to say, I've got a few other presentations later this week as well. Hi, I'm Rob. I work in the product team for Motorsbox. So I asked Michael if I could join his presentation because although he's presenting on the settlements and the work that's been done, we're starting to see some challenges coming out of real-world implementations. So it's a good opportunity for Michael and I just to get some time together and share some of those challenges. But fortunately for us, Michael's also thought through some of the solutions. Virtual hug. So, Michael, back to you, please.
Okay, thanks very much. So really this is going to be two parts. First of all, reporting out on the work that we've done in this PI, and then, as Rob said, talking in a bit more detail about where we see this work going next, responding in particular to real-world implementation problems, which Rob has far more experience of than do I. Anyway, so what was our objective for PI-9? It was stated to be a flexible and configurable settlement service. Well, I'll leave you to decide whether that was a smart objective or not. But anyway, we tried to do something about it. And one of the things that I want to do is to shout out at this point to the team that's done, I think, such an excellent job, this PI, on doing this work. So for the design people, Neil and Joe, the execution from Dion Bothra and Lazola Lucas, testing from Eugene Polshikow, documentation from Lisa Durbin, and finally Theo de Villiers, without whom none of us would have been able to understand what we were supposed to be doing. So they did a great job. Let's see what they did. So far, first of all, we can now define different settlement models for different ledger account types. So that means, and we can define an arbitrary large number of different ways of settling within a scheme, and we can differentiate those by ledger account types. So for instance, in Tanzania, there's a requirement to settle the main principal value of a transaction in one way and interchange fees in a completely different way. And our data model now supports that. We've made the required database changes to support that and verified them as non-breaking to existing implementations. We've extended the API specification to allow new account types to be defined, which wasn't the case before. Essentially, there was a set number of account types that were set up when the scheme was started. We've extended the settlement API to allow people to define models through the API. We can define a rule for calculating interchange fees, and we can attach that to a processing event. James Bush and I will be talking a bit more about that tomorrow in a hopefully successful attempt to attract your interest. We can have interchange fees which are correctly recorded in the switch ledgers. We can extend the settlement API to support settlement model definition. That's in testing. Transfer account entries which are settled gross pass through a per transfer settlement process, which I'll be talking in more detail about in just a moment. That's in testing. We now aggregate transfers only if they are settled net. And we are in the process of revising the liquidity check to take account of settled funds. We had to do that in order to be able to handle continuous gross settlement. So that's our record. We are not completely there, but we're pretty close to being there. A couple of other things that we have to do. First of all, we said that we would exclude the liquidity check where not required. So not every account type would require a liquidity check. We haven't implemented that yet, but that's not required for existing implementations. And we haven't checked what happens with the automated position reset. So in the early days, the position for a participant was reset as soon as a settlement was requested. We need to figure out how that fits in with the more detailed way in which we're managing settlements at the moment. So now I want to go through in a little more detail how our gross settlement procedure works. This is something that's quite new to Mojaloop. When we originally started, we assumed that we were only going to be settling deferred net. So I want to talk through it in reasonable detail so that people get a chance to understand how we're doing it. If anybody has any suggestions about changes that need to be made or improvements, then of course we will be most happy to hear them. So, what's our proposal? Well, first of all, we would add a status of settled to the kinds of status that a transfer can have. At the moment, transfers go through status changes as they proceed through the system, and the final one is committed. And that's when the funds have been cleared and the transfer is, as far as the clearance of funds concerned, complete. We wanted to add a settled status to it so that we could also enumerate those transfers which had been settled, in particular via the continuous gross settlement process. Second, we wanted to generate entries in the switch ledgers to transfer the principal amount of the transfer from the position account to their settlement account. So what that says effectively is that when you go through a gross settlement, i.e. a per transfer settlement process, what you do is you move the amount of the transfer from the position account to the settlement account. We then wanted to add a record to the state change table, the table that marks all of the changes in state that a transfer has, to mark that that transfer had been settled. And we wanted to add records to the participant, well, we wanted to change the positions of the parties to back out the effect of the transfer, actually to move it from the in-flight state to the settled state. You'll see how that works in just a moment when I start to talk about the examples. And finally, we wanted to modify the limits to increase the creditor's limit and decrease the debtor's limit by the amount of the transfer. So now I want to make a brief diversion. We had assumed, again, from the beginning, that funds would always be settled into a single settlement account. But we were worried that that might not be a reliable assumption, and that if we had numerous different types of account settling in different ways, it might not be sufficient to have a single settlement account, and that we might therefore need more than one. So we've added a settlement account to the settlement model, and that means that for each account that's being settled in a particular way, we can also specify what settlement account the settlements are going into. And that means that we can fully parameterize the settlement model, which of course is a good thing. So, go through an example. Here's where a transfer starts out when it gets to completion. So you'll see that the payee's amount has gone down by 100. Don't ask me to explain signs. I don't understand them. Rob will understand them. He will explain them to you. And the payer's principal value has gone up by 100. So that's the original state of the transfer. We now, via the magic of SQL, transfer the settled components to the settlement ledger. So first of all, we join two separate queries to make the update, and that's what the union select does in that query. The first of those picks up any ledger movements which belong to a settlement model which is settled gross. And it multiplies the amount by -1 because what we want to do is to reverse the effect of the original ledger posting. The second generates a balancing entry for each component, but it generates it in the settlement account for that person. So we can now see that the original minus 100 has been balanced in the position account by a corresponding credit of $100, and the settlement account now has a minus 100 value, the same as the original amount, in the settlement account. So that has now journaled for that transfer. The amount has been journaled across from the position account to the settlement account. And the reverse of that, of course, has happened for the payer. Okay? So that's the first thing we need to do. The second thing is we just need to add a state of the transfer to say that transfer has now been settled. And you can see there the various states that it's gone through. Originally it finished up at committed, now it goes as far as settled. So now we've journaled the funds across to the settlement account, and we've marked that this transfer has been settled. Now we need to modify the positions, which we do in roughly the same way. We use the same query as we did to update the ledgers. We don't need to worry about reservations, only about the value, because we will only be doing this for committed transfers. And there is the result. That's what it was like before. And as you'll see, the $100 has moved back and forth in the positions. Okay. And finally, we see the results there. Now, I just want to have a brief moment at this point to say something to Miller. So the rest of you can do whatever you would like to do. Miller and I had a conversation.
Talk amongst yourselves.
Yeah, just talk among yourselves. So we had a conversation, Miller, and one of the consequences of that conversation was that we thought that we didn't need to do anything to the position for the payee. I have now come round to the view that we do, because what we're doing in both of these things is marking the transfer from position to settled funds, and that should work in the same way for both parties.
Yeah, and this makes sense to me. I think the challenge is to be sure that we're exactly at the right point during transaction flow when the positions themselves are updated, and it's asymmetric, so that we reserve funds, which has an immediate impact on position for the payer, but we do not credit the payee until we commit. So there is a few millisecond lag between committing the credit to the payee before you go to continuous gross settlement and then basically take it back and stuff it into settlement in the settlement ledger. But it's still a thing, and it's still something we would do. Whereas in net, it's going to sit there for a while, maybe up to a day. But the point being that, and this was a point made by Anton, that you can credit the receiver upon commitment if you are guaranteed that settlement will succeed, whether it's net or gross. And the design of the system and the scheme makes it so that that is true. That's sort of a level one project principle, that those funds become not only spendable by the end user, where they were credited by the payee DFSP upon fulfillment, but that they are actually usable to outtrade by the payee DFSP now taking a position in a new transaction, as long as that transaction is committed, whether it's settled or not. So I think that would be the only point. Everything you've said here makes perfect sense to me, that you're essentially moving the value from the position to the settlement ledgers in a atomic and journaled fashion is excellent. It gives rise to the ability to do continuous gross settlement, where you're really maintaining account balances or in a potentially joint account. So the trick that comes to that asymmetric updating of positions during the transaction flow and doing them at exactly the right moment and not before or after.
Right. Well, hopefully that is the case.
It seems to be. I mean, everything you described looks good to me.
Okay.
We can, if you want offline, we can talk about the bits where the position are updated. I know that that's a subject of work by the proof of concept team, and it may be done in a slightly different way. But that the point should be at the same point during the transaction flow.
Yeah, well, certainly at the moment, as far as I understand it, it's at the point when the transfer is committed that the funds are moved, in the payer's account, the funds are moved from reserved to value. So it's at that point when the switch marks the transfer as having been committed that the funds that were in the reserved part of the position are now moved across into the value part of the position, i.e. they can't then be uncommitted, as it were.
And likewise on the other side, the asymmetrically, the payee has no change to their position until commitment.
Yes, indeed. So it's only at that point, as you say, that their position will be credited.
And so it's, in essence, it's a funny thing in that there's this notion of reservation that applies only to the payer, but that the payee sees a magical arrival of value at the committed stage. That's the purpose of clearing. And that in both cases, those values become real money during settlement, but they become creditable money at commitment.
Right.
Okay, this is great. Thank you. This is really tight.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear it. Okay, we'll get back to
you're not going to make me read that sequel, right? Because
yes, I'll be asking questions later.
I can see that there's a small trickle of blood flowing out of Rob's ears as he has studied that sequel.
Yes, okay. So the consequence of this, I think, for liquidity cover, I'm going to go through this slowly because I want people to be thinking about it and thinking about whether that really is the way we should be calculating it. So what we're saying is the switch will accept a request to transfer funds if the proposed position, which is the total of any funds reserved but not yet cleared, and any funds cleared but not yet settled, and the amount of the proposed transfer request, is less than liquidity cover, which is the total of settled funds plus or minus any amounts credited or debited from settled funds by the scheme, i.e. deposits into or withdrawals from a settlement account, less any reservations against settled funds made by the scheme or the participant. And the purpose of that is to enable us to say things like a DFSP may have $1 million in their settled funds account, but they may only want 100,000 of those dollars to be used as liquidity cover. They might want to keep the other $900,000 for something else, or they might be concerned that if there is, for any reason, a run on their funds, they might lose money. So we allow them to make a reservation against the settled funds, and we take that into account when we consider whether a DFSP is allowed to make a transfer request or not. Does that make sense? So basically, the first set of things, the proposed position, is everything for which the DFSP, the participant, has to ask for liquidity cover. They have to be able to cover those things because they are not yet settled. And we are checking that against any settled funds that they have, less any reservations against those funds that they have made.
Makes sense.
Any other thoughts? Okay. Right. So that is the work essentially that we've done this PI, and I think we're not completely there, but we are certainly within spitting distance of a fully parameterized settlement system which will support both deferred net settlements and gross settlements, and which will allow schemes to set up different types of settlement more or less ad lib.
And Michael, may I ask, it sounds like you can operate both of those settlement models essentially at the same time, so that you could, for example, say that you're going to use multilateral net deferred settlement for interchange fees settled 30-day basis, and you're going to use from some random settlement account, which might be a line of credit, and you're going to say, but we're going to do continuous gross settlement for the individual transfers. So we're going to settle the principal immediately while we're standing here, but that interchange fees are going to be sorted out over the month, and we will settle those things using some other facility. It won't be the principal liquidity accounts, for example.
Well, I would certainly hope so, Miller, because if we can't do that, then I think TIPS is going to be knocking on our door with a bat.
Fair enough. And this is excellent. Thank you.
Right. So I'll be checking in every day. If you don't hear from me, you'll know that we didn't manage to meet that objective. Okay. So what do we think about doing next? And at this point, I'm going to pass over to Rob, who's... unfortunately, Rob, you have to stop thinking about SQL now and start thinking about all those dull things.
I'm having to think about Excel spreadsheets and thinking of how I've put fraudulent transactions in the middle of the flow to test your system. So just on that point, this is where, you know, at the product thinking level, we try to look at some of the edge cases we go through. But some of those we miss when we get into real world productions. And a number of the challenges that we faced in Mojaloop when we moved to Forex, and the challenges of multilateral and deferred net settlement actually start manifesting. So we've got a couple of key areas. So Michael and I are going to do a bit of a double act at this point. I'm going to give the business challenge, and Michael's then going to put just forward what the current thinking is. But what we'd like at some point is, you know, as we move beyond this, is other parties who are interested in this to actually, you know, join in later as part of the work streams to actually help increase the thinking. The more people challenging these concepts and identifying the edge cases, the more likely we are to build a system that can cope with some of the extremes. So 4 of those that we've got at the moment are custom aggregation, how we manage settlement on demand, and then what we do with the settlement model definitions via the portal, and then settlement recording. So Michael, if you could be so kind as to move me to the next slide, or have I got control?
Nope, you haven't got control.
Okay, so currently transfers are all aggregated for a net settlement in a very standard way. So when we come to the closing the window and saying, okay, this is the function, there's a participant DFSP, a specific currency, the account type, whether they're a debitor or a creditor, net sender or a net receiver. Debitors, just see where they're the positives, and the creditors are the negatives because the asset is you are owed money. And that's the boring part that Michael asked me to comment on later. I've got it in there. Thanks, Michael, for that line in. And then the ledger entry type. If we can go to the next one. That's the chapter how we currently present, but that's the, it has some challenges. That's adequate for most, but there are some examples. One of the challenges we found now we're trying to settle for Mojaloop for cross-currency, when they're sending euro to dinar, which is the first corridor that's gone live, the problem you have for local transfers is they are quite easy to recognize. Cross-border transfers, you might want to settle them differently because of where your settlement and partner bank come. But unfortunately, the windows closing at the same time means that you've got this mix of transfers that you may or may not want to actually work through. And in the same way, when we start looking at that for cross networks, the same problem may also manifest. How do you separate intra versus the normal cross network, or something a bit extraordinary that you want to just treat slightly differently to your normal business process? That's starting to become quite clear as a challenge for Mojaloop. But Michael, I'm going to hand over to you now for the thinking and the big brain.
Oh no,
slide.
You have to set the objective. That's what the customer's there for.
So setting the objective is how do we aggregate all those into simple settlement values? And there is a nasty spreadsheet that highlights this. If anybody's interested and says that's not going to happen, trust me, we can bore you to death with spreadsheets as equally as we can with SQL. So we have those as well if you want to talk through those. But then how do we assign the individual transfers to categories based on their characteristics, such as the Forex exchange rate? And then how do we set settlement statements that are segregated by those categories? So they're the things that we've identified so far. As we said, if people see more, please do call them out, and we're more than happy to start working through the challenges so we can start building the right solutions. So, Michael.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. So, we looked at this actually a couple of convenings ago, but it's not yet been high enough priority to actually make it onto the list of things. But we think now that it is. So the components we think of are, first of all, we need a way of assigning an arbitrary category value to a transfer. We don't want, for instance, something that involves everybody in maintaining long lists of possible entries. We would really like some way that says, well, whatever way you decide you want to categorize things, you should be able to. Sorry, when I say things, I mean transfers, of course. Then we need a general mechanism for persisting the category with the transfer. And finally, an aggregation process that includes categories in the aggregation. And the aggregation, I mean the process that generates effectively a broken down bill that's given to the hub administrators to say, in these categories, these are what the participants owe. Okay, so we already have something which pretty much could assign an arbitrary category value to a transfer. We've talked a little bit about the rules processor that we needed to develop in order to support the generation of interchange fees in the Tanzanian implementation. And I'll be talking a bit more with James Bush about that tomorrow. But essentially, it's a generic rules processor, and it could be used to assign a category to a transfer based on characteristics of that transfer. In the same way as for interchange fees, we look at the characteristics of the transfer and decide whether it's liable to an interchange fee or not. So that's the first thing. We've got something like that. We interrogate the content of the transfer request. What we will need is some new method that we don't currently have to allow us to set a category for the transfer. And that would allow any per transfer categorization scheme to be implemented, because all you would need is a specialized rule that interrogated the content of the transfer in a particular way and then just set a category which you could define based on the content of that transfer. So that's thing one. Thing two, really, we only need to add a simple table to the central ledger database. It's got two columns. First of all, the identifier of the transfer to which the category belongs, and second of all, the value of the category. So that's a non-breaking change. It will just add a table to the database, and that will enable us for each transfer to assign one, or in fact more than one, category to that transfer. We don't want to assign more than one if we're going to be aggregating them, but in principle we could. So we would need to think a little bit about how we restricted that in cases, for instance, like aggregation, where we really needed to be sure that the value only went into one category. As I say, this would be a non-breaking change, be relatively simple to do. And then all we need is an aggregation process. And that just means we need to join across from the transfers table to the transfer categories table. We include the content of each category in the group by clause, where we currently have the currency and the ledger type and those sorts of things. And we just add a default value for null entries, which we allow. So for instance, in the situation that Rob was talking about, where Mawali want to record currency pairs for foreign currency things, but nothing for same currency transfers, we just allow that by not having entries in the categories table, and we just put a default value in. So that's how that would work. So that's the proposal for thing one. I don't know, do people want to comment on that at all? Or do they want me to go on and let Rob set me another problem?
One quick interjection,
Sure.
I might.
Yep.
The process you've laid out makes sense, that you would use the database to both, I guess I'll call it sort and group by the categories, and then to join those categories to the transfers themselves so that you can find in the right order and in the right groupings those transfers that need to be settled together. Mm-hmm. However, the math that's involved in actually doing that settlement calculation needs to be done using decimal precision according to the Mojaloop decimal format, or I think we might have called it originally level 1 decimal format, which is essentially a indefinite precision math calculation. It's not floating point, it's not binary. So that would suggest you have to pull these rows in one by one and do the application level math on those, and then write the updates out again. I realize this is a bit of a detail, but it's one that's actually significant to the accounting correctness of the implementation. Has there been a count made for this, or are you still looking? I think the original design, certainly in the proof of concept, was to allow the database to perform the math, and we have all kinds of round-off errors and problems with that.
So I think my answer to that at the moment, Miller, is that my trust in the integrity of my fellow designers and developers means that I will be able to adopt the process currently used for aggregation summing for this new variety.
In other words, I heard the can get kicked.
I think this is we haven't gone into development stage yet. This is literally just...
Oh, no, that's fine then. I just wanted to raise the point before it was too late, before you could say, no, we've already done.
Very, very sensible.
And this is us preparing for the next PI, so making sure that people know what we're looking at, where we see the challenges, and exactly that point, Miller, is why we're putting it here, to bring those out, to make sure that they're covered early on.
That's awesome. Then my work here is through.
Oh, we're thankful, as ever.
Indeed, for your interventions. Okay, so does anyone have anything else? No, I don't see anything in the Q&A. Nope. So, okay, Rob. Throw me another curveball.
Michael, yes, the next curveball. Okay, windows and where things land is probably how I would summarize this one. All transfers are added to a settlement window at time of commit. Unfortunately, there are transfers that don't quite work when we do that. There's always a single settlement window at any given time, is the second rule that we have. So you effectively open a new window to close the last one. Whenever that new settlement window is opened or created, there is no way of confirming what goes into. Everything new that's committed just goes into the new. That creates a challenge, particularly, again, for Forex. We'll come to that in a second, where it doesn't quite always land properly. Settlements can be composed of whole settlement windows for any given account type, which doesn't give us the option for partial settlements. They could be broken down. Actually, the way we're having to settle means partial settlement is being considered based on the current window structure within Mojaloop. But you can't do that properly and make all the accounting work well within the current settlement ledger structures. So we've pulled all that off temporarily to a reporting challenge, but actually addressing those means that people can think more creatively about how they will do their settlement as opposed to where they're currently constrained today. Michael, if we could have the next slide. So at this point, the exchange rate example I was just talking about is assigned at, so we would use the exchange rate ID as the category group we got in the previous, but based on the current model of how things are allocated to a settlement window, I would have my first leg, which is from the originating DFSP through to the FX provider, and the second leg, which is from the FX provider back to the receiving DFSP. Because of the way you need to commit, you would commit potentially in one window the second leg, which is the receiving DFSPs, and the commit, unfortunately, of the first leg gets moved into the next window because of the timing differences. So that's the edge case. But there are a number of other scenarios where that creates some, some other challenges as well. It means that we've got to basically land. I think for those who recall from Joe last time, the things we have to land in time to make sure the quotes have all gone through. We have a dead spot. That means that we've got a really poor user experience that we'd like to overcome. So Michael, that's the problem. Our objective. I want to be able to settle a group of transfers by defining their characteristics. But I still need to ensure that I leave no transfer, so leave no man behind. I'm going to nickname that one "No Man Behind." I'm sorry, Michael. No transfer left unsettled. So
it's the accountant's version of the Marines motto.
Yeah, boring. Please, Michael, over to you for possible solutions that others can chip in if they wish.
Okay, so our proposed solution is to allow something I'm going to call settle on demand, but I'm happy to call leave no transfer behind. While we continue to support what I'm now calling old school settlements, i.e. the ones that sit happily in the settlement window to which they were originally assigned. So I want to be able to settle by selecting a category or a time period. Now, as Rob says, in the case of Mojaloop, a category might be the exchange rate quotation ID that was assigned to the transfer at the time it was quoted for. I'm going to leave it in a little bracket here, the question of how that gets into the eventual transfer so that we can interrogate it. But there are ways of doing that, and that should not be intolerable given the way we set things up, the way we currently set things up and the things that we're allowed to do. Then, having done that selection, by the way, I should also be able to do that, for instance, by time period. I might want to say, well, I want to settle all categories like this that happened yesterday. But we'll leave that aside for the moment. Then I want to create a new settlement window on the fly. And I want to make sure, of course, that transfers that are being settled at the time don't start flowing into this one. I want to keep this one just for myself. Now, I can move all of the transfers that meet the criteria into this new settlement window. And I can do that just by reassigning the settlement window ID that's they're associated with in the database. And that should be true, whatever settlement window that is. So if I have, let's say, some transfers, a few transfers at the end of the previous quotation cycle, beginning of the new quotation cycle, end of the previous one, lots of transfers in the cycle, and a few transfers the other end, I should just be able to select those into my new window. Then I should be able to create a settlement for this window I created. That will be a deferred net settlement, of course. And away we go. It just works the same way it works now, because I can just say, I want to settle this settlement window, and I will get from that the values, the transfers that fall into that category. But if I continue to support old school settlements, that means all of the transfers which are still in the windows they were originally assigned to can be settled by settling those windows. I don't have to do anything else in order to do that. Sorry, I've got a bit more on there. So any transfers which have been settled on demand, as I say, will be removed from the standard windows. So we can continue to support them, and this will provide a settle all not previously settled option. So if I go through and say, I want to settle everything in these old windows that I've been working with, they won't have any of the new transfers that were pulled out into the new windows to be settled on demand. They'll just have everything that was there originally and hasn't yet been settled in some other way. So that, we think, will provide a relatively light touch and low impact way of providing this functionality.
Michael, if I might ask a quick guiding question. In deferred net settlement, at what transaction moment is the settlement window assigned for that transfer?
It's assigned at the moment of commitment.
And so for Mawali, it's inadequate to code for the quotation.
Exactly.
Because that was captured during quotation cycle, and the lag between that and commitment is non-zero. Yeah. You could have moved
and variable
a different rate at that point, a different rate pair. So
sure.
What you're saying, I guess my question would be whether two things. One is whether the category ID that you're talking about for the settlement system would be considered predefined and persistent, in which case it wouldn't be appropriate for use as a quotation ID, which is relatively, or I should say an FX spot ID, which would be relatively transient, and there'd be lots of them, and you wouldn't know them in advance. You would be doing that at the time a transaction flowed. So using a predefined category for that might not work quite so naturally.
That category would be, in my head at least, based on the stuff Michael had suggested, because the Forex is intercepting that quote, it would say, when you send the transfer, please use this category. So the hub knows and has prearranged that it will have special categories assigned by the FXP, so it can manage those. The same way with cross-network provider, they provide that as part of their flows. I need this tag when you settle, please.
That would be an addition then to being able to handle the spot ID, if you will, for the quote. That means that this transfer is also subject to these categories to be for special handling during settlement, but that I still need the quotation FX that was in effect at the time that I quoted this transaction, which is a transient and highly changing.
But I think we're talking slightly at cross purposes here, and I think that what's happening is that the quotation ID that we're talking about from Mawali is a relatively long-lived thing, because it is the case in Mawali that the bank offers a rate for a 24-hour period, and that rate has an ID. So effectively, every quotation, every transfer that is quoted for during the lifetime of that ID, during those 24 hours, will have that quotation ID associated with it.
And there could be a small overlap, because I've got a quotation in flight against the old one, and the new one has just come into force. So I can see that. I get your point there. My observation is only that the term category suggests a thoughtful application of semantic meaning to a particular group of transactions. It doesn't imply a group of transactions which were temporally related through some other aspect. So I wouldn't, unless you're saying that there is a morning quote, middle of day quote, and end of day quote, and they're always called categories 1, 2, and 3. And I look at the day of the transaction quotation and I combine it with the category to figure that out. You're really talking about coding the transfer with an actual quotation, some kind of FX quotation ID.
Yes.
In addition to the category, which is something else.
No, I think what we are proposing in this case is that at the point of quotation, the foreign exchange provider will say what quotation ID is currently in force for this currency pair.
Right, of the 50,000 that I have ever had in force in the past, which one am I using now?
Yeah, exactly. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it then attaches that to the quotation, and let's say the payer DFSP adds it to the information that goes through with the transfer. So when the rules engine that we've been talking about, the categorization rules engine, looks at the transfer, it says, what quotation ID was associated with this transfer? If it finds one, it will attach that label to it. Otherwise, it won't attach a label to it. And that means that every transfer that has that was quoted for according to that quotation ID will have the same quotation ID with it. And therefore, if I want to settle all of those transfers at a time which is advantageous in terms of the rates that are available, all I need to do is to say, please give me all of the transfers which share the category which is that rate ID.
Oh, I see. So you're saying you will create the window
Yes.
late in the cycle.
At the point of settlement.
Well, what's interesting to me, though, is that you could just do this in the normal net settlement way by having a window open and simply adding transactions to it. It changes nothing. Why would I need to do this in this sort of lazy or late fashion? Why couldn't I simply just apply once the quote window opens, I open a window to go with it, all transactions flow into it.
So the problem is that it's not the case that all transactions flow into it. Some transactions will not flow into it. For instance, transactions which don't contain foreign exchange at all, or which contain another currency pair, they will go into different windows. So the problem that we saw with that, well, not the problem, because of course elegant programming can overcome any difficulty, but the, how shall I put it, the lack of simplicity we saw in that was that the system would need to be constantly maintaining. Every time something happened, it would need to ask itself, do I already have a settlement window which is associated with that thing or not thing? If I do, that's fine, I'll stick it into that one. If I don't, I'll have to create another one and stick it into there. But the problem there is that we need to associate the settlement window with the category, because we need some way of mapping across between those two. Whereas with this one, late assignment, we don't need that. We can just say, once we're sure that we've got all of the ones, we can just pull them out of the bucket where they're currently languishing and stick them into our brand new shiny bucket and settle them that way. We thought it was a simpler way of doing things, and also something that would be more generalizable, that would be easier to apply, for instance, to something that might say, well, actually, if, again, I want to go back to the example we talked about a bit earlier, where a scheme might want to settle cross-network transfers differently from other transfers. And it might want to say...
Yeah, that part I understood. I guess what I was getting at more was the need to create the transaction moment at which the settlement window is assigned to the transaction is at present during commitment, and that seems perfectly adequate for this. It's at that moment I know everything I'm ever going to know about that transfer. I know what quote ID was used for it. I know what categories I'd like it to be part of. All of that information can be applied, and it would seem to me that if you want to do a late open on the window, you could do that, although I would have argued that it's the point at which you set the quotation that it would be most useful to establish the window. But that's a separate optimization. I would have said, as a transfer is committed, you apply it to the currently open window that meets the requirements for settlement for that kind of transaction. You're saying, I think, something different, which is they are committed to a transaction lake that they sit in, and they lie in this lake, but they are uniquely marked such that when I go to do settlement, I can rake through the lake and pull out all of those with the common attributes I want and move them essentially from the lake into a brand new open window that I just created, which I can then submit to the settlement system to settle. If I think I understood you correctly.
Yes, that's right.
So really the window is gone. The purpose of the settlement window originally was to say that you have a developing settlement position, so to speak, that you can look at, that as you add transactions to this window, these transactions can be collected and scheduled when that window closes as a unit batch. So it does two things. It says it's an admission window, but it's also a batch processing window, and you've separated those concepts now, which I think is more flexible. I question whether it's simpler, but I think
I think the other complexity that I think it avoids, and you could tell me whether you think that's right, is I was very keen not to get involved in any kind of process that meant we had to check to make sure that every transfer had been included in some window.
Meaning that, well, but you do still have that problem.
Well, no, you don't. I don't think.
You're basically saying that you're going to rake through looking for specific categories, and there's always the challenge that you might forget to ask for a certain category, and therefore transfers are left behind.
No, because no, I don't think that is there, because I want to go to that thing that says settle all not previously settled. So
Okay.
I can still do the thing that says now settle all the dross that's left at the bottom after I pull the nice tasty fish out of here. All the stuff that didn't make any of those categories is still going to be in the settlement window it was originally in. So all I need to do is to say settle all those dull windows, and I can be confident that I've got all of the transfers without having, as I say, to have a complex reconciliation process. That means I need to be sure that everything has been correctly assigned to one window or another.
No, I mean, it's fine. I think it sounds complete in principle, so I wouldn't argue with it at this point. I think that I might ask that during the review cycle that we do a side-by-side comparison at the, I'll call it the simplicity test and the completeness tests of using the category assignment during entry of a transaction into a window that had been opened previously, so that at commitment, I simply write it into a window and that's the end of it. Or where I write them into the pool and I have to, during settlement preparation, yank them out of the pool, rake them out of the pool into batches and then process those batches. So the concept of window doesn't exist in that second case. And of course, the concept of window doesn't exist for continuous gross anyway. So
that's right.
I'm not sure I want to over-index on it being a magical thing that we have to have.
Sure.
We've got a number of questions appearing in the Q&A, Michael, as well, and I'm conscious.
I'm going to stop talking and let you handle it.
Yeah, well, I think, Julia, I think we've partially answered yours.
You might want to open the mic for each person, just let them ask it. That's another way to go.
So Judith was asking questions. We've got another problem and solution we need to go through in a second. But
sorry, Judith was asking questions. I don't see that in the Q&A.
Yeah, it's gone into the answered stage.
Oh, she's asking you in the chat. No, it's gone into the answer.
It's gone into answered. Yes.
Okay.
So,
so for Godfrey's one, so the idea of this is that you can, yes, sorry, I want to go and answer Godfrey's question. I'll answer the second one. So we're expecting that you would be able to specify on the fly, create a different settlement window, which has settlements in this category or these categories between these dates.
Yeah.
And the system will go and collect those transfers and stuff them into this new window, no matter which settlement window they are currently in, provided, of course, that that settlement window hasn't already been settled. So that will be, but that doesn't mean that you can't have different custom settlement categories in a single window, because it will be possible to, at least in principle, to derive categorizations of more or less arbitrary complexity and say, I want everything that's like that to come into my window.
Yeah.
Does that meet your answer? Sorry, meet your question, Godfrey?
Godfrey can't use his mic, but
okay, all right.
And also, we've got a 7 minutes heads up.
Yes, okay. So the settlements are done asynchronously anyway, Pedro. They are not done in line. So I don't think that would make a great difference. So one of the things that we definitely wanted to do was to move this whole process off the critical path for processing transfers. So this essentially happens in what I want to call the reporting database, i.e. the database into which everything appears after it's finished being committed. And then we can do things with it at any time we want to. Gosh. Yes, but I think, sorry, this is going to Sanko. So Sanka's question is, the suggested solution appears to enable multiple concurrent pseudo-transient overlapping settlement windows. I'm not sure which of those is a compliment. With a time-based window as merely one more window type. Is that what we're shooting for? Yes, because I think we are ensuring by this method that each window is exclusive of all others, i.e. when we collect a series of transfers into a window, that very action means that they can't then appear in any other window. Wow, it's magic. It disappeared. So how does this solution handle the Forex two-legs situation? And my answer to Judith is...
Michael, if I may interrupt, the first part of that question was, as the new settled status is introduced, what happens with transfers stuck in previous states? Are they picked up and requested to be looked at separately for manual intervention? That was the first part. Yeah, I answered them already with
okay, cool. Right, okay. So how does it handle the Forex two-leg situation? And the answer is that both the payer DFSP for the first leg and the the FXP itself for the second leg will include the same quotation ID in their transfer. So therefore, you can guarantee that both legs, when they are extracted, will appear in the same settlement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you, Michael. I'm just digesting what you just said. You remember we had all of these cross-leg situations when we timed out and we see.
So this is completely separate from the cross-leg situation.
You can still get that situation. So cross-legs, for those, and we do need to move quickly. Cross-legs, for those who aren't aware, we have leg A and leg B. When they get mixed up, we just jokingly called them crossed legs because they were just no longer crossed.
Because they just couldn't go.
They just couldn't go together. So that's where the name crossed legs comes from. Apologies for that introduction. But Michael, we have a few minutes left and I have another problem for you and I would like to put that on the table. So we've got that at least in mind. Okay. So this final section is on the settlement API. Clearly we're going to need a structure to this. And then we're going to have to put these sorts of things into portals. More on portals later. But these things we do need to start thinking of.
Yep, I agree. But I don't see that as a problem.
No.
I see it as an opportunity, of course, and because I know that there's some great portal stuff coming down the turnpike, I know that I can just leave that one to be picked up and turned into something yummy as a consequence.
Excellent. But the API. So on the other sub portion on the settlement recording, I think the other area as well is with the gross settlements being moved into the settlement account and positions being adjusted, etc. Liquidity checks are a challenge. For those who aren't aware, there's some controls, and this is the control section of this. There are a number of controls in place. If a net sender suddenly becomes a net receiver, you can find their net debit cap breached by the number of scenarios. So all of that checking and everything else, and the accounting that goes with it, we need to think through as part of our problem space. I'm just mindful I'm going way too fast to give this question real time because we have 2 minutes. But
well, so I think basically what we're saying is that the position we would like to get to, I think, is where we report the settlement of a transfer in the same way, whether it was settled gross or net. These are transfers which are settled, as I say, after they've moved off the critical path. So that shouldn't be too much of a problem. But I think that what we would eventually like to do is to be able to look at a particular transfer and say, oh, I can see that this transfer was settled in this way at this time, no matter which way it was settled. And that we can therefore have the same method of calculation for the positions where transfers are settled net as we can if they're settled gross. This needs an extension of the way in which things currently work, together with a retrospective look to make sure that we're not breaking anything that existing implementations already have. And that, I think, no, I've looked in the bottom of my hat and there are no rabbits left in it.
Yeah, we've had a nice rabbit stew there, so hopefully people didn't have a problem with rabbit stew. If they did, that's accounting. What can we do? We will happily take questions offside as well.
Sure.
There's a lot of stuff here that people have to get their heads around, and it's where the real money hits the settlement. That's where people get frightened. So the controls definitely need to be there. So,
okay. In that case, thank you very much indeed, Simeon, and I hand back control to you.
Thank you so much, Rob and Michael. I appreciate you all keeping time. We're down to the last session of the day, protecting biometrics at the edge of the network. This is being presented by Scott Francis and Emma Lindley, both of whom are here. So I will pass it on to you guys. Emma, Scott.
Okay, cool. So I apologise for my lack of ability to get my PowerPoint presentation to work, but hopefully you can see the screen. So I'm here with Scott Francis, who is our CTO, and I'm the Chief Commercial Officer for TrustStamp. So we're going to talk to you today for about 20 minutes, and obviously we're hoping to get some questions just around the work that we're doing around securing biometrics right at the edge of the perimeter. In terms of the use case that we're focused on, I mean, I've been working in the identity space for about 18 years. And, when I started out in identity, biometrics wasn't really it wasn't a particularly well-developed technology. And it didn't even really particularly work well at things like airports. Obviously, a lot of, there's been a lot of technological advancements since then. And, biometrics are becoming something that is much more widely used. We know that, certainly for people that have no other way to assert their identity, NGOs and governments are starting to go biometrics first. If we look at large-scale biometrics programs like Aadhaar in India. But one of the issues around those large-scale biometric programs is the issue of those biometrics then being breached. Biometrics, if you think about all of the privacy legislation that is, around the world, they're classed as special category data, because if you think about things like usernames and passwords, you can change those. But your biometrics, you can't change your face or your fingerprints or your palm. And so what we're kind of moving towards is this world where we are starting to use biometrics for the ability to be able to prove somebody's identity. But then we've got this tangent thing at the side, which is this risk of those biometrics being breached. And that's really where we at TrustStamp sit, and that's what we want to kind of talk to you about today, and some of the work that we're doing and the approach that we've taken and how we think that might be useful in this context. So the way that we kind of split our core technology is around the customer onboarding piece and then also the re-authentication piece. So within our kind of customer onboarding technology that we've developed, we can do validation of identity documents if it's available, any kind of global identity document, whether that be passports or driving license or identity cards. And we can validate the security mechanisms within that. And then if the document has a facial image on it, what we will do at that point is take a biometric image of the person's face through a liveness check, and we can compare the image that's on the document with the biometric itself, and to check that those two facial images are the same, so that the person actually owns that document. We check some of the security features in the document, we check whether it's been tampered with or not. Now, what we know is there's 1.1 billion people or 1 billion people that don't actually have any ability to be able to prove their identity, so they have no identity documents. For those people, as I said, you know, we're moving to a world where we're going biometrics first. So for those people, we can do biometrics as well, whether that be different modalities of biometric dependent on, you know, the availability of particular devices, you know, the particular biometric that person might be comfortable within that particular culture or context. But then the thing that we do to really make that privacy enhancing is we do a tokenization technique, which we call the irreversibly transformed identity token. And so we take the biometric and we turn it into a format that can still be used and still be recognized. So it's still able to be used for re-authentication, but it's secured right at the edge of a network, because if it's ever stolen or breached or hacked, it's completely irreversible. So when we think about, you know, in context where we're doing last mile solutions, where it's perhaps using an agent network, you know, the device isn't, you know, isn't actually the user's device, we're able to secure the biometric, enable the enrollment, and secure the biometric in that context. And we can do that both in an online and offline environment, because the token actually compresses down to a very, very small size. And that can be used in those environments in last mile solutions for things like deduplication. So in terms of some of the benefits that technology has, and I'll talk to you about a couple of use cases that we've been working on shortly. But it has the ability to reduce fraud, because through if the person has got a document, we can validate some of the security information within the document. We can validate that that document belongs to that person. If they don't have the document, we can reduce fraud by making sure that, you know, it's the same person that's coming back every time, but do that in a way that's obviously privacy protecting. We can increase data accuracy, protecting the personal data right at the edge of a network, increasing the efficiency of all of those processes. So have we, you know, that whole process of knowing whether we've seen somebody before can be turned into an electronic process. That can in turn help with inclusion. So people can perhaps access things like basic financial services. It could be their first stepping stone towards that, or other things that might be required within that context. And obviously also this really important point of improving that data privacy. Because if we look at things like the ADHAR program, where they've gone biometrics first, that has already been susceptible to breaches. So the tokenization process essentially takes any of the identifying data at all, and it renders it safe to use, store, and share. And we can match it through something that we call zero knowledge proofs, so that organizations don't, if they need to kind of verify their data, you know, if another organization needed to verify that data, or two organizations had information about a person, they don't actually even need to share that data to be able to validate that the information is true or not. So, you know, it can be used through mesh networks and edge computing. So it can be worked in environments where there is little or no connectivity. So it is enabled for those last mile scenarios. So some of the other things in terms of, so we've broken this down into the user benefits and the organization benefits and the community benefits. From a user perspective, it gives them an inclusion and access, and that can kind of empower them, you know, to be able to do more with their identity, whether that's, you know, inclusion into things like financial services. Privacy by design, so we're never storing the biometric data, and we can also take these multiple modalities, as I said, that fit cultural and social norms. We can even, within the tokenization process, also fuse those modalities together. So, and that increases the accuracy. So if we were to take, you know, a face and a palm and perhaps fingerprints, we can fuse those together in one token, and that improves the accuracy. From an organization perspective, it's secure by design, so there's no storage of sensitive data that's susceptible to a breach. It improves the enrollment process, and it can be customized to the organization's needs. And obviously it's maintaining adherence with privacy regulations. And from a community perspective, it means that people have got there is a reusable identity. And we can work with any type of biometrics. So we do produce our own biometric technologies, but we can work with any type of biometric provider. So in that respect, it can, it can essentially kind of break vendor lock-in in terms of biometric providers, because we can provide this tokenization methodology between biometric providers as well. So it becomes usable across different technologies as well. And as I said, it's got this offline capability, so it can reach communities that perhaps have been unreachable before. So I think this just kind of talks a little bit more to what I've just gone through. As I said, there are multiple contact modalities: face, fingerprint, and palm. We've got multiple. We can host it in multiple ways, and we don't actually store any sensitive data. So we as TrustStamp aren't storing any data whatsoever. And we also take any sensitive data that an organization might need to share or a user might need to share, and we turn that into this irreversible transformed identity token. So we're actually working with Sajaz in Nairobi, and they've got an agent network. So this is one of the pilots that we're starting to roll out at the moment. Looking at how they might be able to use identity to enable them to deliver more services through their agent network. And we're doing that by providing touchless interoperable biometric toolkits, and it allows them to create a verified community of real people in a way that doesn't store this sensitive biometric information. So that means that they can, deliver more to these communities. They can, because they've got this verified, deduped kind of network of people that they know are real. That means that they can do more with those communities. So that's just one of the use cases that we've got where the technology is being used. And Scott, I don't know if you want to just talk a little bit about the microservices architecture at all, and anything else. And I've actually got the dashboard slide, the mock-up of the dashboard as well.
Sure. So yeah, as Emma mentioned, in order to kind of create an ease of use and ease of deployment, we went with a microservice style architecture. Everything is utilizing REST APIs, passing kind of JSONs back and forth. These are cloud-based services, and allows us to really give the flexibility to the end customer to only include those services that they want, that they need. And as we add new services, and those can then be added without having to recompile or redeploy an entire new solution. We can just add those services in. Each of these work pretty much autonomously. Most of them do not keep state, but what we would do in many cases is put a front-end service that brings all of those together if state is needed in those cases. But it's a really flexible approach that we can put both on AWS or Azure as kind of the cloud-based host at this point, and one that our customers have really enjoyed.
And just, can you talk about the edge of the network deployments and how that works on an offline device as well? Because I think that might be interesting.
Sure. So with a lot of our customers, if there is an issue with connectivity, what we end up doing is trying to keep all of the information on device and utilizing either mesh networking services such as Google Nearby or similar type of things to allow for devices that are within range of one another to share information with one another within the notion of when they hit an area of connectivity to then store that into the master copy. This allows both the ability of one system to be able to kind of act as a method in order to seed information to all the others, and it also allows for kind of almost a viral effect of the information to be passed from whether it be tablet to tablet or phone to phone in a non-connected world. This way, if we have something like a refugee camp that has zero type of connectivity, they can all, as they're collecting information, continue to share the information they connected from station to station.
Cool. And I've actually just got one last slide, which is just, this is actually a mock-up of the type of information that, you know, could be produced via some kind of agent network dashboard. But obviously the service allows analytics to come back, so you can start to understand from a, you know, and all the data is obviously anonymized, but it gives you some analytics back in terms of actually what's happening through an agent network. And so we are, this is a mock-up of a dashboard, but you can kind of imagine how this would work in this context using an agent network. So that's it really. I haven't got any more slides than that, so I don't know if there are any questions.
I don't see any questions in the chat.
I have I can talk, so apologies, Emma. It was me that asked about the recording earlier because I'm actually very interested in this, so thank you.
Okay.
I had a question though, in terms of, and it's a use case that I've actually seen happen where, unfortunately, people have sold their identities. They sign up and register for something. I didn't quite understand how somebody authenticates. Do they authenticate when they transact and they use their biometrics every single time to transact? Yes. Okay. Yeah. So the merchant is basically interacting, they take a photo. So there are some risks with that, but it's, you know, my question was related to how do you stop people selling their identities, or at least their tokenized identity, particularly if they are doing remote transactions.
How do you get them to stop selling their identity? So when
how do you identify if they have? So I'll give you a very simple example, and
yeah,
you know, it's a public forum, so I'm going to do this as well. Yeah, we identified 300,000 accounts that had actually been created falsely, even though biometrics were required to actually register. We identified that the accounts had all moved from where they'd been registered to a part of the world where, why are they suddenly there and why so many? It links into a question that was asked by John Mark earlier on in terms of the fraud stuff. I'm not sure if you were here. But it's how do you, if you're using biometrics, you know, if it's only used as a singular and then you've got your token, that token can be passed to another individual and you've now lost touch that is the same person.
So if we see the same token used twice, the identical token, if it's absolutely identical, we know that that is some kind of fraud or a replay attack.
Okay, but so every single time that somebody's identity is captured, the token is recreated. Okay.
Yes.
But
yes.
Yeah, let me split a little more. When we create this hashing, we know, I take a picture of someone's face, even if I take back-to-back pictures, through this hash transform, it's not going to create an identical token each and every time. In fact, if you ever create an identical token, we know that to be a fraud attempt. What the kind of the magic or the secret sauce, if you will, is this probabilistic matching that we've created on the tokens that we've created. So there's never a chance, or probabilistically next to impossible, that you would ever see the exact same token being generated. Again, whenever we do, we would say that is absolutely 100% a replay attack. So if that notion, first off, if we ever see the exact same token, you know, regardless of the area, we know this to be an issue. If we see something that is also, we collect geospatial information with the tokens also. If we see something that is probabilistically matching but impossible for someone to cover those types of distances, obviously that could be something that can be accounted for also.
Excellent. There is one question in the Q&A. If you have access to that, Emma or Scott.
Okay, so Godfrey said, please expound more on GDPR-centric data protection features within your solution. How will it help an organization operating in GDPR zone meet PII data protection requirements. How do you use biometrics without collecting and storing it? In terms of the GDPR data protection, the tokenization process and the process that we go through when we do the create the irreversibly transformed identity token, we actually throw away a lot of the data, and we're not retaining the template at all. So we throw away a lot of the data. We add a salt. This is the technical description. And so it's not actually and we throw away the biometric templates because they're no longer required. And then as Scott said, we're then probabilistically matching on that token. So it's no longer biometric data. And so it can be, and what we're saying, what we're not saying is, you can do organizations still need to do a privacy impact assessment. Organizations still need to make sure that they're securing the data. I think what we're saying is it is not as sensitive as raw biometric template data, and therefore it can be retained for a longer period. And if it was ever stolen, then it would be completely unusable to the attacker, unlike a biometric template, which is still is obviously highly usable to the attacker.
There is two more questions. One in the chat from Matt. Do you work with voice as a biometric or other biometrics that might work with non-smartphones? And then the second one from Paul in the Q&A panel. How large a task is it to integrate trust stamp into a DFSP's merchant payment acceptance network? Perhaps you want to start with Matt?
Yes, sorry, could you ask that question again? Sorry, oh, there we go. Matt, how do you work with voice as a biometric or other biometrics that might work with non-smartphones? So we can work with any type of biometric modality. We don't currently have voice biometrics, but there is no reason why the technology couldn't work overlaid over voice biometrics in terms of the actual token itself. So if there's already a voice biometric, we don't provide currently voice biometrics, but if there is a voice biometric provider, we can tokenize the voice biometric, and then essentially it could be used in that method the same way. So the voice biometric can be retained for a longer period. So it's just the same concept. And then to Paul's question, Scott, do you want to take that? So how large a task is it to integrate Trust Stamp into a digital?
Sure, I'll give the standard answer, which is it depends. In general, right, the pre-existing infrastructure is always important to notice or to understand. In general, though, again, if the provider is used to working with kind of REST-based APIs, then this is not an overly difficult process. It's very similar to the data is sent, to the microservices. Information as far as what is processed is sent back. We provide kind of a litany of services, whether it be just providing the API or also providing kind of full stack integration in your current existing services. If someone is just looking to get their hands on the API and start rolling, it's literally 1 or 2 weeks worth of kind of onboarding and getting in, providing some instruction to their dev teams. If there's customized solutions, then of course, those types of time horizons start lengthening.
We've got another question, haven't we? Can you support multiple biometric types on one identity token? We have another client who actually uses multiple biometric types and fuses them into one token. We call that fusion. So they take 3 different types of modality of biometric, and as I said, that increases accuracy because you've got more information about the individual. So yeah, that's possible. There's another question: do you include gesture biometric, i.e., finger swipe on a smartphone? Scott, I'm going to pass that one to you.
I'm trying to understand what's being asked.
I think it's behavioral biometrics. So
yeah, we started looking into behavioral biometrics. A lot of it also depends on what the solution paradigm is, whether this is an installed solution as an app, or if this is something where it is a web-based. Obviously, what you can do with behavioral biometrics really is also going to be dependent on how much control of the ecosystem that you have. We don't have a native behavioral biometric solution in place at this time. It is something that we've definitely looked into. We're also trying to see long-term how behavioral biometrics is going to play in the privacy field, and whether there's going to be legislation that comes around that. So we're extremely kind of excited about the notion, but we're also kind of sitting back to just see, okay, you know, there are some areas where face is becoming issue, and we're questioning whether or not behavior also might become issue at this point.
I think we have all questions covered.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emma and Francis.
I had one, I'm sorry, I have one quick one in there. I would just, more of an interjection, if you would, Scott, that as you guys look at behavioral biometrics and other things, I'm reminded of a statement made in the title of a Google paper on the subject that, that AI is the high interest credit card of technical debt. All joking aside, meaning by that if you start using too much of this AI interpretation and machine learning interpretation of different aspects, you can run afoul of the GDPR rules that say, how is it that you use my data? How is it approved? How is it that it's interpreted? You may have difficulty explaining that to an end user. So I would challenge somewhat that aspect of this during the design phase.
Right. And again, with behavioral biometrics, especially when you think about GDPR, the question of consent kind of comes into play, right? And making sure that you are fully compliant in a GDPR world. Again, I think there's some interesting things around behavioral biometrics. I think some of the early people that were definitely exploring it, some of them have backed off a bit. I know here in the States, the US government is definitely interested in it, but more around their own military and making sure that military secrets are covered. And that's a very different kind of use case than what we're talking here. But again, I think that it definitely offers a lot of promise. I think that there's a lot of consideration that goes into proper, to your point, kind of how would this be implemented? How is this properly communicated of what's actually being captured, what's being done? And then how is that also secured?
Thank you. Yeah, that makes sense.
Awesome. I don't see any other questions. And so we will end it at that. Thank you so much, Emma and Scott. That brings us to the end of day 2, a day that saw us go through a number of foundation, community, and business updates. We have a pretty exciting day tomorrow. Tomorrow we start the technical updates, most of them updates from the various work streams over the last PI. I think we have a total of 8 sessions tomorrow. We begin at 11 a.m. UTC. And just as a heads up, tomorrow we usually, if we're all together in person, we would sort of huddle behind like a Mojaloop banner and take a group photo. And because that's not possible physically, we'll try and do that tomorrow evening at the end of day 3 tomorrow. So you might want to put on a coat or make sure you're looking good, and we'll have everybody's camera on, and we can take a couple of screenshots and therefore immortalize our meeting virtually this quarter. I'll leave it at that. I do want to check and see if Paula or Kim, if you've got any last comments before we close.
No, all good. Thank you. Great session today.
Yeah, just want to thank everyone for the great presentations and everyone's attention. We've still got quite a few participants that have remained on, and look forward to a successful day tomorrow.
Excellent. See you, everyone. See you tomorrow, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.